All right, so while this loads, sorry, I'm trying to just make it present. F5 should work. Yeah, superb. So while this loads, my aim here today is just to sort of expose you to this wonderful thinker who's written wonderful books, which to me are a sort of alternative current, even compared to many of the philosophies that I normally study in my studies, and are certainly a novel sort of viewpoint compared to, I don't know, the traditional ways of looking at the world that are present in our zeitgeist, in the sort of collective consciousness of our society. So I just try to pick out a couple key thoughts or ideas and remarks that he has, and present them to you in this sort of format. My main hope is that you'll be persuaded just to, I don't know, read an essay or two of his, because I think he's much better at presenting his own ideas than I am.
Speaking of presenting, the button is on top right. Next to
thank you, lovely.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I was trying to find it on the keyboard and it wasn't working. Okay, amazing. So yeah, I think he's better at presenting his own ideas than I am. So this is a caveat. If anything, if you find anything sort of angering or incomprehensible, that's probably my fault, rather than the fault of the original author. Yeah, this is what I just said. It's also of note that he's related to the discipline called cybernetics or systems theory, and this discipline sort of encapsulates a lot of the fascinating thought that's been happening from the 50s onward in America, Britain, and continental Europe. And yeah, I'd just like to illustrate that today. There's a sort of obligatory way of beginning by presenting the person. He's a British zoologist, anthropologist, psychiatrist, and co-founder of cybernetics, which I've already said, and an interdisciplinary thinker. He's originally born in the Great Britain, studied zoology at Cambridge, and then immediately just went off on sort of all these anthropological expeditions. He sort of described tribes and different cultures at Bali, for example, and has published many books about that. But the way of thought he has, where he mostly looks at relationships rather than individuals or individual things, means that he's very easily able to connect very disparate disciplines, as you see. So zoology, anthropology, psychiatry, and even the cybernetic systems, which cybernetics doesn't just mean, we design robots. It's a fairly confusing term, so I'd just like to take a minute to elucidate it. It's from the Greek kubernetes, which means basically like governor, in the sense of someone who controls a larger system, or in the original etymological sense, I think it was the man who was steering the wheel of the boat. So it's in general a science about systems and about controlling these systems and thinking about them as systems rather than as collections of individual things. There's a motto of his that I think will be useful to what will follow in my presentation. Most of our problems stem from an incoherency between our thought and the way nature actually works, which really sort of could be read as an esoteric hippie sort of, there's like, we need to get back to nature. But it can also be read as a statement of attempting sort of scientific rigor and coherency. And I think this is really the duality of this man. I think there are both of these two sides to him, and you can't really reduce him to one of them. And it's a combination that isn't often found in people, thinkers, scientists. And yeah, this was the slide I was initially supposed to talk about cybernetics in. I think most of the information that's here has already been said. Systems rather than individual entities, and there's an important feature about the subject matter that cybernetics studies, which is that the systems it studies usually contain causal loops or feedback loops, self-propagating or self-reproducing or self-correcting, self-diminishing. And conventional logic is usually unable to handle these without contradictions, paradoxes, and self-referentiality. So different ways of thinking had to be developed when people started thinking about cybernetic systems. And this is something I've already mentioned also. His point of view is primarily to start from relationships and structures and only to substitute in individual entities, beings, humans, animals, neurons, bits and bytes, parts of electronic circuits afterwards. And this makes these thoughts very sort of generalizable and useful in varying fields, from the studies of populations to individual neuronal pathologies to for example, electronic systems. And the way I thought about doing this, and the way which most sort of correlates with the title I've chosen for this presentation, which was that I was supposed to sort of examine some of the key metaphors we use in our conventional day-to-day thinking and in governing society, and examine the alternatives that he proposes or he has in mind, or the alternative perspective, which looking at things through a cybernetic lens can give us. So I've prepared sort of 3 little case studies, if you can call it that, and different problems or sort of metaphors, ideas that are understood in some way in conventional thinking, and really could be looked at from a completely different perspective. So the first one, first issue that arises in the sort of conventional way of thinking is the mind-body problem, and philosophically, this has been with us possibly for a long time since before Descartes, but has really come to the forefront of the attention of thinkers with Descartes or René Descartes. It's this in no way aims to be an exposition of particularly Descartes or Newton's or someone else's view, but rather a generic statement of how we tend to think of these things, where the mind is thought of as entirely separate from the body, a completely different sort of ontological category, and existing separately from it, being the philosophical term is transcendent rather than immanent. If it were immanent, it would be inside the body, precisely sort of located and functioning, whereas as transcendent, we think of the mind as something extra, something going beyond the boundaries of the body, and somehow not commensurable with the body. And it's supposed to contain or be somehow related to a self. It's supposed to be constantly self-conscious, so sort of checking in on itself, aware of everything that it's doing. And this self-consciousness is supposed to be sort of transparent to it, right? We're supposed to be completely aware of the thoughts we are thinking, where they're coming from, what their aim is, and their results and their motivations. And this doesn't actually seem to work under scrutiny, under scientific scrutiny. And there's a third sort of weird fault that this is often attributed to humans, the ability to think, to have mind, to cognize, to be rational. And this is also strongly disputed in philosophy and among scientists. And bodies, on the other hand, are supposed to conform to Cartesian and Newtonian laws, right? They are supposed to be extended in space and move when you touch them or when there's a collision, and really have nothing to do in the business of consciousness, which can't, as I think is the intuition, consciousness is really hard to describe in Newtonian terms, right? So we think that framework isn't really sound in trying to make sense of or provide an order to mental phenomena. And you might say that sort of the mind-body problem has been overcome philosophically. There are many alternative schools of thought already. Everyone knows this. But really, I think the issue isn't whether or not we've overcome the idea. I think if we continue to engage in practices which stem from this conceptual sort of mistake, then it's no good saying that we have better ideas now if we're not acting on them, right? What's an idea without its practical manifestation? So, for example, in the way people are usually taught, even in the lecture I'm giving, this is even an example that Bateson gives in his own book, in sort of frontal teaching or unilateral teaching, where I'm the only one speaking and you're sort of there as sort of minds sitting in bodies trying to just receive the information without any sort of activity or awareness of the surroundings, which can be interchangeable. This is a strange situation, or the sort of search for authenticity and trying to find a true self. This is quite possibly mistaken in the case that, in the sense that a self is a very confusing concept. You can't really locate it, right? So how should you be able to find a true self? And it only manifests sort of in a particular environment and in relationship with other people. And it famously varies and changes a lot in different interactions. So what is a self, right? And I don't want to be radically skeptical, right? In fact, the contrary is true. I want to offer a positive conception which allows us to actually think about these things. But in order to be sort of clear in that, we can't have sort of vaguely defined terms and nonsensical questions flying around. So here comes, there are some other issues with this view, right? Exactly, what language do we even use to talk about a mind or a self? If we can't use the language of natural science, which sort of is naturally like testable, if we can't pin it down spatially or in time, and if we only have sort of the usual ways of talking about it, which are often confused, how do we make it, for example, testable? And can we even talk about it without confusion if we're always within this mind, have no way of seeing outside of it, of assuming a distance from it, and have no access to any other minds, because we can only see the symptoms of other people having minds, but we can't really see into their heads. And the last question, which is supposed to really problematize the issue of even having a self, like, can we assign boundaries to it? Can we say, here's a self, and here the self stops? In any sort of sense, in the physical, or whether we see it as a system of cause and effect, or whether we mean in time, right? When do we start having a self? When we start talking, when we start being self-aware? When do we stop having a self? Do we have a self when we're dreaming? Do we not? Right? How do we tackle these questions in this sort of confused framework? I'll come back to these illustrations after we've discussed the next frame, actually. So these are some additional issues with this problem, and the cybernetic view actually tries to define sort of mind, or at least maybe not rigorously defined, but try to find a way of talking about the events and phenomena which we ordinarily would call having a mind, and find such a way which can ascribe a mind to many other beings than just humans, and can also not localize a mind, but show clearly why it is not localizable, or why it is nonsensical to ask such a question. So the cybernetic school talks about mind with reference to the notion of information, which is a sort of hairy term to define, and with reference to networks. So we just have some sort of causal networks, right, of objects influencing one another, and information flows through these networks. So we first need to define information. And Bateson defines information as a difference which makes a difference, which is still sort of vague or abstract, but it can be a very sort of clear meaning can be, or at least intuition can be assigned to it if we imagine concrete examples. So let's say you're walking in a garden, and you see a tree with an apple on it, and you're hungry. In this instance, seeing the apple, right, the perception of the apple, the, I don't know, light rays bouncing off the apple and hitting your retina, is different than if you were seeing a barren tree without any apples. So this is the difference, right? You see that this world is somehow different from one that doesn't satisfy your needs, and in the causal network of you and the tree, the sight of the apple actually produces further differences. This starting difference actually propagates itself from the visual perception. It enters. It causes the thought of I ought to go pick that apple, right? Then it transforms into a different signal to your motor system to move toward that and reach out your hand, and then it transforms again into another difference, which is the difference from an apple on a tree to an apple that's being picked off a tree, and then entering into your mouth. And then there are different transformations, but really this is the sort of closed loop. And what's important is that it is not a sort of singular difference that sort of dies out in time. In that case, it just wouldn't propagate. It wouldn't actually be information, because it wouldn't be useful to anything, right? I'm saying right, but I know this is as of yet somewhat unclear, because this is a different way of thinking, and it's hard to put it into words all at once, or without good illustrations. But I think if I through the course of this talk give a couple more demonstrations, I think it'll become clearer and clearer. And this network isn't actually abstract and transcendent. It can be named, right? It can be described in a diagram and labeled, and it can be seen that the conscious act cannot reside only in the mind, because the brain in itself, right? If we were trying to localize it in the brain rather than in the mind, which was a slip of the tongue, I meant to say brain. The brain can't do anything. It can't receive signals, and it can't perceive things, and it cannot influence the world. So it cannot enter into this sort of interaction, two-sided, where it sees states of the world. For example, the state of the world which contains a tree, an apple tree with an apple on it, and it cannot alter these states to see if any difference has been made, and change itself according to how the world has changed. enter into this sort of two-way relationship with the rest of the world. So without this, the brain is just a sort of isolated, weird organ that really can't be said to be doing all of the weight of consciousness, right? There were these other examples of the blind man walking with a stick, or the steam engine with a governor, and these were supposed to illustrate the two facets of this definition: self-correcting network, that is, and a network in which information flows. Self-correcting networks, it means it just doesn't go out of whack. It doesn't explode. It sort of tries to maintain some parameters constant over time, right? A person tries to stay alive. A blind man tries to stay walking to. I'll stop here. I'll rephrase it. A blind man tries to not fall down or something. And the steam engine has this little thing called a governor. Without it, it would just continue to spin and spin and spin. Probably some of you are much more expert in this than I am, but without it, it would just continue to spin until it exerts until it runs out of all the steam or fuel that's running to it. It would spin terribly fast and just do nothing. With this governor, this little thing keeps its energy expenditure constant. It keeps it from going out of whack. So in that sense, it has a very little, tiny, small bit of consciousness in that it's a self-correcting or somewhat like homeostatic system. And what this blind man was supposed to illustrate is that we can't really isolate the consciousness of this blind man to just any part even of his body, because without this stick, he wouldn't be able to perceive the road in front of him. He wouldn't be able to move, and he wouldn't be able to receive information from the world, which is completely crucial to his survival and to his sort of self-correction. Any attempt to sort of draw a line, which is, and trying to say this is where the consciousness of this man ends, or this is where it ends. Well, the stick is, then again, it's tapping a piece of ground, and if that piece of ground weren't there, what use would the stick be? So you can't draw the line there. So I think this just, or according to Bateson anyway, and my sort of shabby demonstration, this is supposed to show that it's a nonsensical question to try to delimit consciousness in this sense. Okay. Maybe I'll have a single technical question. Am I talking too fast, perhaps? Okay, never mind. There's a second problem, which is very strongly related to the first one, which is that we see ourselves as individuals that are completely separate from our environments. And somewhat strangely, we as conscious beings we as A, conscious, and B, highly civilized, highly technologically advanced beings are able to make this mistake, while, for example, animals, even if we treat them as less intelligent, are not. If I were to be consistent, I should say animal populations, because we, in our sort of highly technologically developed homes, can just treat ourselves as individuals who are trying to survive, trying to whatever, be happy and not die, and we don't actually need, or it can appear to us that we don't actually need anything else, anything outside of ourselves to interact with and to, for example, gain sustenance from, or trade with, engage in relationships with. And the main name and aim of the game is just sort of to survive as this individual that I am here. This is a strange picture when we compare it to, for example, an animal population, right? So imagine an animal population in an ecological niche. For example, a herd of cows grazing on a field, And from the sort of evolutionary standpoint, try to think what would happen if they just overgrazed on that field, if they were just constantly against the environment within which they're located, and just sort of exploited or all the vegetation, and the field became barren, right? The next season they or even the next month they couldn't survive. They wouldn't be able to survive, and this sort of population, it could conceivably happen because the cows are quote unquote stupid, but long term and from the evolutionary perspective, such a population is unthinkable, right? Because in evolutionary terms, it's not just an organism that is surviving, but it's the combination of organism and its environment. And it's paradoxical to try to think that it isn't so, that it's just single individuals trying to maximize something, for example, the amount of food intake or happiness or whatever, against everyone else and against an environment, right? And this even becomes a logical contradiction, because it wouldn't be a self-sustaining equilibrium, therefore it wouldn't survive long-term in terms of sort of evolution. And this little note down here is just what I said at the beginning, that our consciousness or the sort of extra patterns of thought in language actually enable this falsehood rather than preventing it from happening. There's a second example which I think I might be running out of time, so I'll leave this till the end, because it would be another bit that I'd have to explain for fairly long. And the third question, which I think his view on evolution, which is both sort of determined by what people thought about evolution at the time, and is alternative to, for example, what Darwin thought. Not in this, well, it's Darwinian in its main tenets, and then there are some differences. I didn't want to say anything else. Anyway, on the problem of nature versus nurture, or on the supposed problem of nature versus nurture, the tendency to think that we are born with some innate characteristics, and then some other characteristics are, which can be clearly delineated, are acquired through learning, or are sort of inculcated in us, into us by our parents, teachers, environment, and such. And this is also talked about as if these were ideas that are placed into our before then empty minds, right? Using language or perceptions. And as if this were happening, again, independent of the environment. And again, we run into the problem of trying to pick apart the two different fields. What is natural and what has always been in us versus these traits that are supposed to be learned, or sort of culturally determined, since all of these traits only manifest themselves in particular environments and in acts of communication with other people, and these traits vary wildly between environments, and this sort of picture of these being qualitatively different things just breaks down, because if they were qualitatively different, we could tell them apart clearly, right? And it's often the case that a particular child adapts to a situation he was presented with often in his childhood. But and then it becomes his character trait. But how can this be differentiated from a long-term character trait, or from something that has always been there, right? My point is just that this is not a question that can be asked without nonsense, or that can be stated clearly. And the second line is basically saying that that it's also unanswerable if you're only looking at it as individual people which have individual traits, and traits that don't in any way interact with other traits and with other people and with the environment they're submerged in. And again, there is a partially related and positive answer or alternative presented in sort of unifying, in saying that learning is the process of learning and of sort of acquiring mental habits, let's say, is basically the same process as evolution. And while usually they occur at different timescales, they're basically analogous, and there is overlap or a seepage from one to the other. Right? So again, if you use the perspective of talking about information, one can see that learning is essentially akin to evolution in that it's just trying to determine a sort of economy or survival of ideas. You just have a randomly determined starting state, and occasional inspiration comes in, but the ideas that survive are propagated through selection and reinforcement, and can be seen or can be looked at in a very similar way to sort of animal populations, right? So you have an idea and choose to present this to other people. It spreads to them if it finds fertile ground to jump to spread to other people, and it then competes with other ideas, is tested against the environment these people live in, is when they try to practice what those ideas tell them, and enters into these sort of feedback loops where sort of some viewpoints, some ideologies or ways of looking at the world lead you to avoiding some behaviors and engaging excessively in other behaviors, which reinforce that very same way of looking at the world. So, for example, an example would be cults, right? If you submit to the set of ideas that in a cult, they tell you that no one outside is to be trusted, that the leader is a holy elect that will give you your salvation if you obey his every word, and so on and so on. And this is a set of ideas that reinforces itself, because if you act according to it, it will become stronger in you without ever learning that it could be false. And there is sort of these different ideas, and some actually work, while some are simply self-propagating in this way. But it's a really interesting question, and I'm presenting a very sort of reduced picture of what he's saying, and but he has a very interesting theory of what learning actually is, and different levels of learning. So he describes even a single encounter with a perception as level 1 of learning, and then he says we also learn to learn. We also learn to next time process things better, and we change our sort of meta habits of thought like that. But that's something I don't think is necessary to go through, depending on how much time we have. Anyway, and can I ask how much time I've spent talking? Because I can't see my clock over the presentation.
30 minutes.
Oh my. Okay, well, I think that that's all then.
But there's still one thing you need to do, and that is to introduce yourself, because I didn't do it, but I said you would do it, but then you didn't. So,
this is very awkward. Sorry. My internet broke down while Indra was introducing me, so I didn't hear him talk. This is very awkward. Okay. Well, an introduction at the end. That's wonderful. So my name's Ondřej. I study at the Faculty of the Arts, basically, Filozofická fakulta Univerzity Karlovy, and I'm in year 2 of my bachelor studies at the Institute for Philosophy, I guess can be said, and this and sort of this school of thought or sort of interdisciplinary school is sort of my pet little favorite subject to talk and think about, because it isn't sort of restricted to just philosophy, right? It's interdisciplinary. It actually can say something about the world and try to interpret it and talk about scientific questions. So that's why I chose to present it to you, really in the hope that it would be somewhat interesting rather than confused, and it would make you want to read just a single little essay. I do promise that that his writing is much more clear than my verbal presentation.